I don't know why I woke up right then. Maybe it was the wind slipping through the crack in the door, or the sound of quiet footsteps in the hall. But then, in the middle of the night's stillness, I heard every word, every syllable, like knives twisting in my heart. "My dad disgusts me," Stephen's voice, the voice of the same son I'd raised with these calloused hands and a lifetime of sacrifice. He said it softly, but clearly enough for me to understand everything. From the next room I heard his wife's voice, a young woman's voice, icy. "Lower your voice, he'll hear you. It doesn't matter, he doesn't get it, he's old." And then they both laughed, a dry laugh, like dust. I stayed perfectly still, not breathing, as if the slightest movement could break something inside my chest. I thought I'd gotten used to the silence of old age, but that night, the silence wasn't peace anymore. It was an abyss. I closed my eyes, trying to pretend I hadn't heard anything, as if it had all been a dream. But no, every single word, "disgust me," kept echoing, sharp, like it was seared into my bones. I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling. The hallway light filtered under the door, creating a thin, trembling line. I saw my hand on my chest, thin, veins standing out, and still, it felt as heavy as a rock. I had put up with a lot in my life: hunger, poverty, the sleepless nights after my wife passed. But I had never known a pain like this, being a source of disgust for my own son. I didn't cry. At 78, it seemed the tears had dried up. I just felt a knot in my throat, like an invisible hand was squeezing it. I heard their laughter fade away. In the house, all that was left was the regular tick-tock of the clock and my own breathing, heavy, raspy. I turned to look at the photograph on the nightstand, the photo of Carol, my wife, who had left me too soon. I whispered in the dark, "Do you hear that? Our son just said I disgust him." The wind blew through the curtains, making the photo vibrate slightly. I wondered if, had she lived, things would have been different. Maybe not, because sometimes, even if you give everything, people change. I stayed in bed until the sky began to lighten. I couldn't sleep a wink. Every minute that passed was a small stab in my memories. I thought about the past years, about little 5-year-old Stephen, who would run after me to the door, grabbing my shirt and saying, "Daddy, don't go." Where was that boy? I didn't know. Maybe he had died a long time ago, buried along with the days I thought were happy. Outside, the birds started to sing. I got up, put on a jacket, and went to the kitchen to make coffee, like every morning. I held on to my old habits, but inside, everything was different. When the water boiled, the steam hit my face and I looked at my hands. They were trembling slightly, not from age, but because I knew that, from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. And I whispered, low enough for only me to hear, "If a son feels disgust looking at his father, maybe it's time for the father to look at himself." I come from a place where the ground is hard, the wind blows dust, and people learn to grow with their hands, not with words. My family was so poor that the wooden bed frame was the only thing that survived the leaks in the roof every spring. I finished grade school and dropped out because my father died young, and my mother had to wash other people's clothes to feed 4 kids. I started working construction at 14, back when they still called me skinny. I pushed wheelbarrows of sand, mixed concrete, learned to endure the heat and the ache. But it was there, amidst the banging of hammers and the smell of lime, that I learned one thing. A man has to stand on his own 2 feet without waiting for anyone to rescue him. I worked without rest, every cent earned with the sweat of my brow. At 26, I married Carol, the girl who sold flowers at the market, the one with the dark, sad eyes, but who always smiled. We had 2 kids, Stephen and Monica. The day they were born, I felt my life light up, as if the heavens owed me happiness and had finally decided to pay up. But life is never fair for long. Carol died young, a fever, an afternoon with no time for goodbyes. Standing by her bed, watching my two little ones hug each other and cry, I understood that from that moment on, I would be both father and mother. I wasn't rich, but I never let my kids go hungry. I got up every day before dawn, made a black coffee, ate a piece of dry bread, and went to the work site. When I came home in the evening, no matter how tired I was, I tried to read them a few pages from a storybook. I don't remember all the nights I spent mending Stephen's clothes, or the times I stayed up watching over Monica when she had a fever. I only remember the smell of their hair, the scent of cheap soap, and a "thanks, Dad," so quiet only I could hear it. That was what made me believe all the effort was worth it. I felt proud seeing Stephen go to a good school with a clean uniform and shined shoes. I'd brag about him to my co-workers, telling them, "He's going to be an engineer, not a laborer like me." I sold my only motorcycle to pay for his last year of college, and I still remember his graduation day. I was standing at the end of the row of seats, my back soaked in sweat, but with a smile I couldn't wipe off my face. That was the day I believed all my sacrifices had been rewarded. And Monica, my younger daughter, sweet and of few words, so much like her mother. She always used to say, "Dad, you're the strongest man in the world." I would laugh and tell her I was just a man who knew how to endure. Years later, when work got better, I managed to open a small hardware store. It wasn't big, but it allowed me to hire someone and spend more time with my kids. I was able to buy my first house, the same one Stephen would later call the Old Palace. For me, it wasn't just a roof, but every brick of my entire life. Remembering all that doesn't make me proud, only sad because it turned out that everything I worked so hard to build, I had given to someone who now looked at me with contempt. I gave a lifetime of love to someone who didn't know how to return it. Sitting by the window, listening to the sound of cars on the street, I suddenly thought, maybe it was because I loved him too much, that he forgot how to love back. From that morning on, I started to see everything in the house with different eyes. Nothing had really changed. It was still the same old kitchen, the cream-colored walls with the paint peeling a bit, the cactus on the porch that bloomed every morning, but I felt a coldness seeping into every corner. It didn't come from the wind, but from people's attitudes. Stephen got up late as usual. He came into the kitchen, gave me a quick glance, and asked dismissively, "Sleep well, Dad?" I nodded, smiling as if I hadn't heard anything the night before. I served him a cup of coffee, my hand steady. "Fine, son, just fine." He thanked me. He took a sip and focused on his phone. Not another word. Between us, only the sound of the spoon against the cup, rhythmic and strange. I looked at his hand, long, clean fingers, no calluses, no trace of metal, nothing like mine. I suddenly thought that maybe that's why he saw me as dirty, rough, disgusting. That thought was like a pin, small but stuck right in the place that hurt. At midday, he worked in the living room, his laptop open, headphones on, his voice sounding firm and decisive. He was calling someone, probably a colleague. I passed by chance and heard a few words. "Yeah, he's still living with me. You know, old slow. Don't want him falling in the middle of the living room." And then a laugh. I stopped for a second, and then I kept walking in silence toward the garden where I myself had planted every rose bush, now with withered leaves from lack of care. I sat on the stone bench, looking at the house I had built with all my strength, and for the first time in many years, it no longer felt like my home. It felt like a cage. For the rest of the afternoon, I barely spoke. I did what I always do: water the plants, wipe the table, tidy the kitchen. But inside, something was burning on a low flame. It wasn't anger, but a devastating sadness, the kind you feel when you realize you're nothing more than an object in your own house. At nightfall, Stephen had dinner with his wife. They spoke in whispers, laughing now and then. I was sitting at the other end of the table, in silence. They didn't notice my presence. After a while, my daughter-in-law got up and cleared the plates, while Stephen said loudly, "Dad, don't get up. I'll do it." But I knew it was just an empty, polite gesture. I nodded and cleared my own plate. As I passed the living room, I heard them whisper, "He's quiet all day." It's better this way. I went back to my room and closed the door. The room was in shadow. Only the ticking of the clock could be heard. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at my old shoes, placed neatly on the floor. Those shoes had been with me for 10 years. They had trod on thousands of feet of dirt. They had walked through countless construction sites. I bent down and carefully wiped the dust off them. In that moment, I felt like I was the last one who still remembered the past. That night I didn't sleep either. I sat by the window, listening to the wind whistle through the screens, thinking about Carol, about the days I held little Stephen in my arms. I asked myself, did I spoil him too much, to the point that he forgot what gratitude is? And then I understood. It's not time that separates people, but the silence between two hearts, when one no longer wants to listen, and the other doesn't dare to speak. I sighed and took a sip of the cold coffee on the table. In the mirror, my reflection returned a tired but clearer gaze than ever. I knew that if I continued in silence, sooner or later I would disappear completely, even while still living in my own house. And from that, a small idea, clear and calm, began to grow in me. It was time to leave. The next morning I got up earlier than usual, an old habit. Make coffee, open the door to let the wind in, listen to the city wake up. But this time the aroma of the coffee wasn't as strong as before. Maybe because my heart had grown cold. I looked around the kitchen. Every object, every little corner I had bought. This wooden table I built myself. That cabinet I painted with my own hands. But Stephen never saw the paint stains on my hands back then. For him, everything was just there. While I was tidying up, I opened a cabinet looking for some papers. By chance, I found an old box covered in blue fabric. At noon, Stephen came home for lunch. He talked on the phone through the whole meal, typing on his laptop without looking at me. I was sitting across from him, in silence, listening to every yes, no, of course, and then a talk later. When he hung up, I asked quietly, "How was work today, son?" "Fine, Dad. I'm really busy. Don't worry about that stuff." He answered without looking up. I looked at his face, that of a grown man, a stranger with no trace of the boy who used to run to the door to wait for me when I came home from work. I remembered the times I had sacrificed for him. The day he lost his job, I sold a small lot I owned on the outskirts of town to pay his back taxes. Another time, I gave him the main truck from my shop so he could start his own business. I even remembered the night I stayed up, drawing up a business plan for him to present, because he told me, "Dad, you have more experience." At the time, I was happy to help my son. I didn't know that each of those acts was slowly turning me into a shadow, making him believe his father would always be there to fix his mistakes, whether they were right or wrong. Now all of that was just footprints in an old man's memory. I looked at my hands, the fingers that had built a house, that had rocked a son, and that now only trembled as they held a coffee cup. I exhaled, very softly, as if letting go of a piece of the past. In the afternoon, I tidied my room. Every object had its own story. The desk where Monica wrote in her diary, the pillow Carol had sewn. I walked through each room, as if saying goodbye to it all. Stopping in front of our faded wedding photo, I whispered, "Carol, I've done everything I could. Maybe it's time to learn to let go." I sat on the bed, took a small notebook, and wrote a few lines. Love, when it's not valued, becomes a burden. Maybe the kindest thing I can do for my son now is to disappear from his life. I closed the notebook and looked out the window, where the afternoon light was fading. In that instant, I didn't feel anger or fear. just a lightness in my heart, the lightness of someone who finally accepts the truth. As night fell, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind whisper through the leaves. The smell of damp earth and wood smoke hung in the air. In the distance, the sound of a car faded. I closed my eyes and told myself, "Soon, Carol. I'll leave, quietly, like the shadow nobody notices when it leaves the house it once built." I didn't tell anyone what I had heard, nor did I say a single word to Stephen. I held my silence like you hold a wound in your chest, without touching it so it doesn't bleed. But the more I tried to suppress it, the clearer the pain became. The following days, I lived like a shadow. I did everything as always, at the same time, with the same routine. Make the coffee, sweep the porch, water the plants, cook lunch. But my spirit was no longer there. One morning, while washing a cup, I saw my reflection in the water. The gray hair, the tired eyes, and behind me, the spacious house I once dreamed of having. I remembered how, when I was young, I believed that with a solid roof, my children would never want for anything, that the brick walls would protect our love. I was wrong. I forgot that a home is where there is affection. Otherwise, it's just 4 empty walls. That afternoon, Stephen came home late. He walked in talking on his phone, with the cold look of a stranger. I greeted him, and he nodded without looking at me. I stood still, listening to his bedroom door close. In that instant, something inside me broke slightly, without a sound, like a crack in a mirror. And in that crack, I saw a truth clearly. The love between a father and a son can die in silence. That night, I took the small notebook I always used to jot down things for work, and I opened a new page. I wrote, "When a son no longer needs his father, you shouldn't force yourself to stay and remind him. When love becomes a burden, leaving is also a form of kindness." I closed the notebook, put it in a drawer, and sat in silence for a long time. The room was in shadow. Only the wind rustled the curtains. I thought of Carol. Sometimes I still spoke to her as if she were nearby. "Carol," I called softly, "I've done everything I could. I raised our son to be a good man, but he doesn't see me anymore." In the darkness, the photo on the table vibrated slightly, and the yellowish light illuminated her face as if she were nodding. The next day I began to gather my few belongings, not because I wanted to run away, but because I needed to put my soul in order so I could leave. I put together some clothes, a few papers, a photo of Carol, and my father's old watch, just enough for an old man looking to find his peace again. In the afternoon, when Stephen left the house, I walked through each room. The house was bright, but it had no warmth. I touched the walls, the small cracks I had filled with putty myself, and I thought in silence, maybe it's time. I didn't feel anger or resentment or failure. I only felt one simple thing. It was time to get my dignity back. When a father realizes his son looks at him with contempt, he shouldn't cling to that love, because it's not love anymore. That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch, watching the moonlight on the patio tiles. A gentle breeze brought the smell of damp earth. I took a deep breath and felt a strange calm. There were no more tears, just a serene determination. To leave this place, not to run away, but to start over. I whispered into the void, "Carol, I'm leaving. This time it's not for work, but because I need to live the rest of my life as a person, not as a shadow in my own house." The next morning, as the sun was just peeking over the roofs, I opened the window, letting the wind in with the damp smell of the earth and the jasmine on the porch. The house was strangely quiet. Only the drip of the coffee maker and the beat of my heart, rhythmic and heavy. I looked around, feeling like every object was watching me. The wooden chair I built with my hands, the old closet with the scratch Monica made as a child, the stained wall I always promised to repaint. Everything breathed of the past, but it no longer belonged to me. I poured coffee into a cup with a slight tremble in my hand. I thought about that night, about tomorrow, and about everything that was to come. Everything seemed already organized inside me, without rush, without fear. I've lived long enough to understand that life's important decisions are usually born in silence. I took the photo of Carol from the shelf. She was still smiling, with the same kind look as always. I sat in a chair, placed the photo on my knees, and spoke to her quietly. Carol, if you were here, maybe everything would be different. I'm tired. I don't want to hate my son, but I don't know how to love him anymore. I gave him everything, and maybe that's what made him forget my worth. The wind from the yard gently moved the curtain, making the light dance on the picture frame. I felt that Carol was listening to me, in silence as always. But in that silence there was empathy, not judgment. I still clearly remembered the day she died. Stephen was only 5, Monica 3. I promised her at her bedside that I would raise them to be good people. I kept my word, but I never imagined that at the end of my life, the one thing I failed to teach my son was to be grateful. That afternoon I went out and went to the bank. After leaving the bank, I walked home. On the way, I passed by the old hardware store where I was a customer for many years. The owner, an old man with gray hair, looked at me in surprise. Elias, how long has it been? What can I do for you? I smiled slightly. I'm here to ask something simple. If I wanted to sell a house, do you know someone trustworthy? He nodded and jotted down the number of an older, reliable real estate agent. I thanked him. With the paper in my hand, I walked out onto the street. The wind hit my face, but I felt lighter than ever. When I got home, Stephen wasn't back yet. I sat at the table, opened my notebook, and added a line. It's not death that separates a father from a son, but indifference. When a father understands he is just an object in his house, he must find the door to leave on his own. I closed the notebook and put it in the drawer. In that moment, I didn't feel like a loser, but like someone who had just woken up from a long dream. I got up and looked one more time at Carol's photo. You know, I'm not leaving for revenge. I'm leaving to keep what's left of the human in me, before my son takes that too. I turned off the light, leaving the room in the pale twilight, and in that darkness I clearly heard the voice of my heart. It was time to go, for real. On Monday morning, I woke up early as usual. On the porch, the dew was still shining on the leaves. The distant crow of the neighbor's rooster was an old habit I had heard for decades. But this time, when I got up, I knew today would be different. I put on the white shirt that Carol liked so much, buttoning it carefully, and looked at myself in the mirror. In it, I saw an old man with gray hair, sunken eyes, but with his back still straight. I looked at myself and said quietly, "Today, Elias, we start new." I carried the paper with the real estate agent's phone number. After I called, an older man's voice, measured and polite, answered, "Mr. Elias Ramirez? A pleasure. Tell me, how can I help you?" "I want to sell my house, but I want discretion." There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then he replied, "Understood. Can we meet today?" "Of course, at 3. The meeting took place in a small coffee shop near downtown. The man, named Mr. Arthur, was around 60. He wore glasses and looked neat. He listened to me without interrupting, without curiosity. When I told him the house had no debts or mortgage, and that it was solely in my name, his eyes lit up with surprise. "And you're sure you want to sell it? It's a very nice property, Mr. Elias." I nodded. My life was nicer when my family still looked at me with love. The house doesn't make sense anymore. We handled the paperwork quickly. Arthur promised to find a discreet buyer, without flashy advertising. I signed some papers. My hand didn't tremble. When the ink dried, I felt as if an invisible rope that tied me to the past had been cut. When I returned home in the afternoon, I walked down the hall, looking at everything with a different gaze. Every brick, every door frame, The walls I had put up with my own hands now seemed strange, as if they no longer belonged to me. I touched the wall, and it felt cold, not from the concrete, but because the hearts of the people inside had grown cold. At night, Stephen came home and asked, distractedly, "Dad, I had a long meeting today. Is there any coffee left?" "Yes, son, in the pot." I served him, watching him in silence. He didn't notice that my gaze was different, nor did he see the real estate agent's business card on the table next to an unmailed letter. After dinner, I sat on the porch, the streetlight casting a yellow glow on the tiles. I looked at my hands, the same ones that had built this house, that had held my son, and that were now about to sign it away. I didn't know whether to call it loss or liberation. I only knew that in my heart there was a void, not heavy or painful, just silent. The next day, Arthur called with news. He already had an interested party. A foreign businessman wanted to buy it immediately, paying in cash. Everything happened so fast that even I was surprised. He told me, "It seems fate is in a hurry, Mr. Elias." I smiled bitterly. Sometimes when you take too long to decide, life decides for you. That night I wrote a few more lines in my notebook. A house can be lost, but dignity cannot. I once built walls of cement. Now I am learning to rebuild myself with silence. When I finished writing, I heard Stephen laughing while talking on the phone in his room. He was telling someone, "This house will be mine someday." I smiled slightly, without bitterness, without anger, the smile of someone who has already understood everything. I turned off the light and looked around one last time. The moonlight came through the window, illuminating the familiar objects. I said quietly, "Carol, I'm almost gone. There's no more room for memories in this house, but I'm still here. The memory is still here, and we, even if we are only the breath of the past, will continue together, but in another, quieter place." 3 days later, the deal was closed. All the papers were signed on a foggy morning. Mr. Arthur shook my hand, his gaze full of respect. "Congratulations, Mr. Elias. Everything is in order. The buyer is paying in cash, and the transfer is being made today." I nodded and thanked him. I felt no joy or regret, only the feeling of having fulfilled one last duty to myself. When I left the office, the midday light hit my face, so bright I had to close my eyes. A chapter of my life had just closed, as softly as the sound of a wooden door closing behind me. I returned home in the afternoon, to the house that was no longer mine. Everything was the same, but I saw it differently. Every object, every wall, seemed to be saying goodbye to me in silence. I walked down the hall, stopped at our wedding photo, and gently touched the dusty glass. "Carol, it's done." I managed to let go. I took my old canvas bag, folded my clothes, packed some papers, the photo of Carol, my father's old watch, and the small notebook, the only things I considered my true inheritance. I paused for a moment, looking around the room. It was a strange feeling, as if I were leaving my own body, but remaining conscious. I took the yellowish piece of paper I had prepared from the drawer, put the pen to it, and wrote slowly, each letter careful, without trembling. "Don't worry, son. You won't have to pretend anymore. The one who embarrassed you is gone. Take care, Stephen. I hope one day you understand that love isn't inherited, it's earned." I folded the paper, put it in a yellow envelope, left it on the dining room table, and placed a small stone on it so it wouldn't blow away. I looked around one last time. The house was silent. The afternoon light came through the window, making the dust motes glow. I remembered the day I finished building this house. Stephen was 10, Monica 7, and Carol was still alive. That day we ate for the first time in the living room without doors, the wind blowing in with the smell of fresh lime. I thought it was the beginning of a happy life. Who knew it would be the place where the last years of my relationship with my son would end? I went out onto the porch. I locked the door without looking back. On the street, people walked by in a hurry. I pulled my suitcase slowly, listening to the sound of the wheels on the sidewalk. Every turn was a weight lifting from my heart. At the corner, I stopped and took a deep breath. In front of me was the bus stop. I took the first one that went downtown. On the bus, I sat by the window and looked out. The city, Cleveland, faded away, its lights reflecting on the glass. I put my hand in my jacket pocket, where I kept the transfer receipt, proof that everything now belonged to me, and only me. I got off at the last stop and took another bus to the airport. I had bought the ticket 2 days before. One way, no return, to Phoenix. No one knew. No one asked. I sat in the waiting area watching people say goodbye with hasty hugs, while I only had my suitcase and a heart as light as a bird's. When the plane took off, I looked out the window. The city grew smaller and smaller, until it disappeared. In that moment, I didn't feel sadness, just a strange peace, as if for the first time in my life, I could breathe deeply. I closed my eyes gently and told myself, "Son, I'm not leaving out of hate, but out of love, because there are some loves that, to save them, you have to let them go." The flight landed in Phoenix at 9 at night, a strange city with a dry wind and the smell of dust. I dragged my suitcase to a taxi and asked the driver to take me downtown. I didn't have an exact address. I just knew there were some small, cheap, and quiet boarding houses there. We stopped in front of an old wooden sign with peeling paint, the Hopewell. The name seemed ironic, but maybe it was also a sign. I knocked on the door. An older woman in her 60s opened it, looked me up and down, and then smiled kindly. "Looking for a room, sir?" "Yes, a small but quiet one." She nodded and led me down a narrow hallway. My room was on the second floor. It was small, with beige walls, a bed, a table, and a window that overlooked an alley. I set my suitcase on the floor and took a deep breath. For the first time in many years, I was in a place with no memories. That night, I didn't turn on the light. I lay there, listening to the sound of cars on the street, the distant bark of a dog. In my mind, I heard Stephen's voice again. My dad disgusts me. His laugh, my daughter-in-law's laugh. I thought I would feel pain, but no, just exhaustion. I said quietly in the dark, "Carol, I did it. I'm gone." The next morning I woke up early, opened the window, and a cold, clear light flooded the room. I made coffee in a small electric pot. The aroma of the coffee mixed with the morning breeze, reminding me of so many years past. I didn't know how to start over at my age, but at least I knew I wouldn't have to listen to the sighs of someone who considered me a burden. My first morning, I walked around the neighborhood. Phoenix was bustling. People were going to work, buses crowded the streets. But I felt a strange peace. No one knew who I was. No one called me old man. No one looked at me with pity. I bought a coffee and sat on a park bench, watching the children play. A little boy fell and started to laugh. His father bent down to pick him up, brushed the dust off him, and gave him a hug. I watched them and smiled slightly. Maybe I looked like that too in the past. At noon, I went back to the room and took out my phone. 17 missed calls. All from Stephen. One text message. "Dad, where are you? I don't understand what you did. You sold the house. Why?" I read it without replying. A moment later, the phone vibrated again. Another message, this time with a harder tone. "What did you do, old man? Are you crazy?" And then another, his voice trembling, as if he were scared. "Dad, please, answer me. Let's talk." I left the phone on the table. My heart wasn't beating as fast as I thought it would. I just felt a void, as if those words had arrived too late, when there was nothing left in me to respond. I wrapped the phone in a towel, turned it off, and put it in the suitcase. I knew that if I listened one more time, my will would falter. At night, I walked around the blocks near the boarding house. The streetlights stained the street a pale yellow, and the smell of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. I heard some old men laughing in a corner store, the music from a small bar, and I realized that even though I was alone, I was still alive. I still had breath. I still had legs, and I still had the right to choose peace for myself. Back in my room, I wrote a few lines in my notebook. Son, you will call, you will get angry, you will cry, and then you will forget, and I will start over. Because sometimes, to save love, you have to learn to walk away from it. I set the pen down and looked at the ceiling, where the dim light filtered through the small window. The sound of cars on the street faded away. I closed my eyes gently, and in that instant, I felt my heart at peace, that rare peace I had searched for all my life, but could only find when I lost everything. The first few days in Phoenix passed slowly, but without heaviness. Every morning, I woke up when the sky was still hazy. I'd make a cup of black coffee and sit by the window, watching the light flood the street. I'd hear the call of a street vendor, the screech of bus brakes, the voices of children calling for their mothers. These seemingly trivial sounds made me feel alive, even if no one knew my name or was waiting for me at home. One afternoon, while sitting in the small courtyard of the boarding house, an old man sat down next to me, leaning on an old wooden cane. He had a square face, bright eyes, and a thin gray beard. He looked like someone who had lived a lot. He spoke with a deep, slow voice, the voice of someone used to conversing with time. New here, right? Yes, just arrived a few days ago. I'm Roy. I live in room 7. I smiled. Elias. A pleasure, Roy. We talked like two strangers finding a little warmth in the middle of a cold city. The afternoon faded. We stayed there, not saying anything more. The wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, bringing the damp smell of approaching rain. In that silence, I suddenly felt my heart calm down. It had been a long time since I'd spoken to someone without having to give explanations, without having to prove anything. From that day on, Roy and I became friends. In the morning, he would knock gently on my door. Coffee, old man? And I'd reply, always. We'd sit in a corner of the porch, each with his cup of coffee, watching the street wake up. People went to work. Students laughed. The sky cleared. And in that brief moment, I felt more at peace than ever. Sometimes we talked about our children. He'd say, kids are on loan, Elias. We raise them, we feed them, but they don't belong to us. Some come back, others get lost. I would just nod. There are truths that don't need to be discussed, only accepted. At night, I would write in my notebook. Each page contained only a few lines, but it was the only way I had to hold on to a part of myself. Day 8 in Phoenix. Still not used to the solitude, but I'm not afraid of it anymore. Here, nobody knows I'm someone's father, and nobody despises me for my age. I'm just Elias, and that's enough. One day, while walking through a small market near the boarding house, I saw a group of kids playing soccer in the sun. One boy fell and scraped his knee, bleeding a little. I quickly went over to help him up. He looked at me with his clear, dark eyes and smiled. Thanks, mister. I froze because in that smile, I saw for an instant the Stephen of my childhood. The same eyes, the same laugh. Before time and ambition turned him into someone else. That night I went back to my room. I poured a cup of coffee and sat on a small wooden chair. The wind from the street came in, light but sharp. I said quietly, Carol, maybe I'm still lucky, because in this strange place I found a little warmth from people with no blood ties, no strings attached. I took a sip of coffee and added one more line in my notebook. Sometimes, family isn't where you're born, but where they listen to you without judging. And I realized that peace, really, isn't in any one place. It only comes when you stop waiting for someone else to understand you. One morning, While I was sitting with Roy on the porch drinking coffee, the landlady brought me a thick white envelope. "This is for you, Mr. Elias. It arrived a little while ago," she said before leaving. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope. Neat, cold, with the name of a law firm. I had a bad feeling. I opened it and slowly read each line. "You are hereby notified of the intent to contest the sale of the property located at—" I read it 3 times to fully understand. Stephen was suing me. He was claiming that when I signed the sales contract, I was not in full use of my mental faculties. In other words, that I was senile, that I wasn't aware of my actions. I laughed, not out loud, just a huff of air that sounded like the wind. I didn't feel anger or surprise, just relief, because I had already seen this coming. Roy looked at me and asked quietly, "Something wrong?" I folded the paper and replied, "Nothing I didn't expect. It's my son, and he wants what's no longer his." He just shook his head and said slowly, "When love doesn't teach respect, life takes care of it." That afternoon I went to the bank. Herrera, the young advisor, recognized me immediately. I handed him a copy of the documents and said, "I'm going to need certified copies of all the transactions, and a medical statement from my doctor, the one we filed." He understood instantly and nodded. "Legal problems, Mr. Elias?" "No, just truth that need to be put in writing. Before selling the house, I had done everything by the book. I had a medical certificate confirming my full lucidity, a video of the signing before a notary, and even a statement that I read myself, clear and articulate. Everything was on file. I wasn't worried." The next day I called the law firm listed on the envelope. When the secretary answered, I said calmly, "This is Elias Ramirez. Please tell the lawyer that his client, my son Stephen, can forget about this lawsuit. If he insists, I will have to present evidence that will embarrass him in front of a judge." She was silent for a few seconds and then just said, "I will pass that along, sir." I hung up. In the room, the afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating the still steaming cup of coffee. I laughed to myself, not because of the victory, but because I realized that, for the first time in my life, I had learned to defend myself without needing to shout. 3 days later, there were no more letters or calls. But one night, when I turned on my phone to check the news, the screen flickered. 20 new messages. "Stephen." I opened one. It was his voice, hoarse, tired. "Dad, I didn't know you had done all that. I didn't think you would just leave like that. The thing about disgust, it was a stupid thing to say. I'm sorry. Please, come back." I listened to it until the end and turned off the phone. I didn't cry. I just sat still, looking out the window at the twinkling city lights. I thought about Roy's words. There are some wounds that aren't healed with justice, but with distance. I added one more line in my notebook. "Son, there are apologies that don't need to be heard, because when a father's heart has grown cold, only silence remains, and silence is also an answer." Then I closed the notebook and poured myself more coffee. Outside, the night in Phoenix was so quiet that you could hear the faint whisper of the wind on the rooftops. For the first time in many years, I felt truly firm, not because I had defeated anyone, but because I had finally chosen peace for myself. A week later, I was sitting on the porch of the boarding house, writing a few lines in my notebook, when the old phone vibrated softly. It had been off for a long time, but that day, I don't know why, I turned it on to check the time. An unknown number appeared on the screen. I was going to ignore it, but a feeling stopped my hand. I answered, "Dad?" I froze. That voice, sweet and trembling, I couldn't mistake it. It was Monica, my daughter. "Dad? Are you there?" It took me a few seconds to find my own voice. "Yes, honey. I'm here." There was a long silence between us. One of those silences that can only exist between two people who have been apart for a long time, but still love each other. Then she burst into tears. It took me so long to find you. Nobody knew where you were. Stephen wouldn't say anything. He just told us you had sold the house and disappeared. I asked slowly, my voice calm. And did he tell you why I did it? He said you had a crisis, that you weren't well anymore. I smiled slightly. Of course. It's easier to say that than to accept the truth. Monica went quiet. Then she said, her voice choked, Dad, I didn't know anything, I swear. But I suspected. He hasn't been the same for a long time. He became arrogant, cold. I know, honey. You don't have to explain. I heard a sigh on the other end of the line, and in her voice, I heard something I hadn't heard from Stephen in a long time. Sincerity. Monica continued, in a lower but firm tone. Dad, I want to see you. I need to hug you. Ethan asks about you all the time. That name made my heart stop. Ethan, my grandson, Monica's son. I remembered he was born on a rainy day and I held him in my arms. So small, smelling like milk. I hesitated. A part of me wanted to see my daughter again, but another part was afraid everything would get complicated again. I was afraid of hearing more excuses, of seeing looks of pity. But Monica's voice softened me. I'm not asking you to come back, Dad. I just want to see you, look you in the eyes, and tell you thank you for still being here. I sighed. All right, honey, but come alone. Yes, Dad. I promise. It'll just be me. 3 days later, I was waiting for her at the bus stop near the boarding house. A taxi pulled up. Monica got out. She hadn't changed much, only her gaze was more mature. And there was something of Carol in her, a soft, quiet sadness. When she saw me, she bit her lip and ran to me. Dad! She hugged me tightly. It was a long, trembling hug, as if she wanted to repair all the broken years. I didn't say anything. I just put my hand on her back and patted it. We sat in a small coffee shop nearby. Monica took a box of cinnamon bread from her bag. I made it, like you used to like. I smiled and tried a piece. The sweet and spicy taste of cinnamon spread through my mouth, bringing back distant memories. She told me many things. About her job, about Ethan, about how she missed her mother, about the years she kept quiet for fear of Stephen. I listened without blaming her. When she stopped, I told her, Honey, don't blame yourself. Everyone carries their own story. Yours, at least, still has tenderness. She looked at me with damp eyes. Dad, can I come see you more often? I nodded, smiling. Always, honey. This door, however humble, will always be open for you. That afternoon, when Monica left, I was alone in my small room. On the table was the half-eaten box of bread. I cut a piece, took a sip of coffee, and looked out the window. Outside, the sunset was falling, painting the sky a fiery red. I wrote in my notebook, Sometimes love doesn't come from someone new, but returns through those you thought were lost. Monica has brought back Carol's warmth, and maybe, thanks to that, I'll learn to love again without fear of being hurt. A week after our first meeting, Monica called again. Her voice was light and enthusiastic, like a child's. Dad, I'm coming on Saturday to someone who wants to meet you. I smiled, guessing immediately. Ethan? Yes, he says he wants to see his grandpa, Elias. On Saturday morning, the sky was clear. I got up early, tidied the room, wiped the table, and set out 2 coffee cups and a glass of milk. I don't know why, but my hands were shaking a little, as if I were about to be reunited with something I had lost a long time ago. When the taxi stopped in front of the boarding house, I went outside. Monica opened the car door and a boy of about 8 peeked his head out with bright dark eyes. Are you my grandpa, Elias? Yes, son, I am. He smiled and held out a small ball. Will you play with me after breakfast? I nodded, a lump in my throat that kept me from speaking. The three of us sat in the small room. Monica had brought more cinnamon bread, and the aroma of flour and cinnamon filled the air. Ethan told me about his school, the neighbor's dog, and how he wanted to learn to play the guitar. I listened and smiled. Every time he said, "Grandpa," I felt like a piece of my heart was being mended. After breakfast, we went to a nearby park. I sat on a stone bench, watching him play soccer, laughing his head off. A gentle breeze was blowing, lifting the dry leaves. In that moment, I remembered Stephen when he was little. The same bright eyes, the same laugh. A shadow of sadness touched me. But then I told myself, not all children grow up to forget love. Ethan ran over to me and flopped down beside me, out of breath. "Grandpa, Mom says you make the best coffee in the world." I laughed. "Maybe, but only when there's good company." He looked up, tilting his head. "Then why didn't you live with us? Mom said you were on a trip." I looked into his clear eyes. I couldn't lie to him, but I couldn't tell him the whole truth either. Sometimes adults need to find their own place too, son. He was quiet for a moment, and then nodded. "And did you find it now?" "I think so." He smiled and suddenly hugged me, a small, warm and sincere hug. As evening fell, Monica said it was time to go. Ethan didn't want to. He grabbed my hand tightly. "Can I come back, Grandpa?" "Of course, whenever you want." When they were out of sight, I stood at the door for a long time, looking at the dusty street. His small ball was left on the bench. I picked it up, wiped off the dust, and placed it by the window. That night I didn't sleep. I sat down to write in my notebook, my handwriting shaky but firm. Today I was called Grandpa again. Sometimes life takes a son from you and gives you back a grandson as a way of reminding you that love doesn't die. It just changes form. I closed the notebook, listening to the wind outside. I didn't feel alone anymore. In my heart, a small spring had just begun. Ever since Monica and Ethan found me, my life took on a new rhythm. Saturday afternoons no longer passed in long silence. They would arrive, bringing with them laughter, the smell of cinnamon bread, and the scent of soap from a child's hair. Ethan would run around the small courtyard, laughing loudly, while I, sitting in a chair, watched mother and son, as if I were seeing a lost part of my life being returned to me. One day, Roy suggested I go with him to the community center. He said they organized gatherings for seniors. They played chess, told stories, shared life experiences. I hesitated. It had been a long time since I'd been in a crowd, and a part of me still feared that people would see an old man abandoned by his son. But Roy said, "Sometimes when you tell your story, you give courage to someone else who doesn't dare to speak yet." I thought about it all night and finally agreed. That afternoon, I put on my oldest shirt, took my notebook, and entered a small meeting room. There were more than 20 people, of different ages, sitting around a round table. They were telling stories about old age, about children who lived far away, about loneliness. Some laughed, others cried. When it was my turn, I stood up, my hands trembling slightly. "My name is Elias Ramirez," I began, my voice hoarse. "And I sold my house because I heard my son say that I disgust him." The room fell silent. I could hear the faint creak of a wooden chair. I told my story without rushing, without drama, like someone pulling thorns from their heart. I spoke of my life of work, of Carol, of Stephen, of the night I heard those words, and of my decision to leave in silence. With every sentence, I felt as if the wind were blowing over an old wound, stinging, but at the same time, drying it out. When I finished, no one said anything. A petite old woman with completely white hair got up, hugged me, and said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Elias. You said what many of us feel and keep silent." And then the whole room applauded. It wasn't a loud applause, but soft, sincere. In that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. I wasn't the only one forgotten by his children. There were so many seniors like me, sitting in the darkness of their old houses, wishing someone would listen to them, at least once. At night when I returned, I sat at the door and wrote in my notebook. Today I spoke with a trembling voice, but with my heart in my hand. I didn't tell my story to get pity, but to remind those who keep silent that loving is not enduring, and that respect is the only debt that children should never forget. I closed the notebook, listening to the distant sound of cars on the street. My heart didn't feel so heavy anymore. I knew I had done the right thing, not to confront my son, but to stand up for myself. That night, the wind on the porch blew as soft as Carol's hand stroking my hair. I smiled, took a sip of coffee, and thought, maybe I've finally learned to speak without needing to shout. And in the whisper of the wind, I seemed to hear an answer. That's how a heart heals, Elias, by speaking with dignity. Time passed, and Phoenix slowly became my home. I got into the habit of going to the market in the morning for bread, having coffee with Roy in the afternoon, and writing a few lines in my notebook at night before sleeping. On weekends, Monica and Ethan would visit, bringing laughter, the smell of cinnamon, and a simple happiness. I thought my life had finally found peace, but life rarely stays silent for long. One afternoon, Monica came alone. As soon as she walked in, I saw the heaviness on her face. She set her bag on the table and sat in silence for a moment. Dad, I have to tell you something, but promise me you won't get angry. I nodded slightly. Tell me, honey. She took a deep breath. It's Stephen. He's in trouble. Bad trouble. He got fired from his job. I remained silent. Monica continued, her voice slow. There was an audit. They found irregular movements. He denies it, but everyone knows it was him. He's desperate. I looked out the window. The last light of day illuminated my hands, which were trembling, not from fear, but from pity. Pity for a son who didn't know when to stop. I asked quietly. And what do you think I should do? Monica lowered her head. Nothing, Dad. I just wanted you to know. He didn't ask me to come, but I know how he is. When he feels cornered, he attacks. I nodded, understanding immediately. Stephen had always been like that. When he lost control, he looked for someone to blame. And usually, that person was me. That night I couldn't sleep. I went out on the porch and sat watching the starry Phoenix sky. I remembered every stage of my life, the years of exhausting work to raise my children, the long nights with no company but the sound of the wind. I sighed. There are children we love with all our souls, but that love can't save them, because they don't need love. They need consequences. The next day Roy came to visit. I told him briefly about Stephen. He listened and then said, "Don't carry him anymore, Elias. Fathers teach. Life corrects." That sentence echoed in my head all day. At night I opened my notebook again and wrote, "I'm not angry with my son, but I won't save him anymore. Because if I keep holding out my hand, he will never learn to stand up." Sometimes kindness must also have limits. Monica returned 2 days later. She said Stephen was trying to contact me, asking her to give me a message. I just asked her, "Did he ask you to intervene?" "Yes, but I won't. I think he's finally hitting bottom." I looked at my daughter and took her hand. "Honey, if he comes, don't open the door without thinking. A desperate man doesn't seek redemption. He seeks refuge." She nodded, her eyes red. When she left, I sat in the dark with the yellow light from a lamp cast on the wall. It started to rain, small, constant sad drops. I didn't pray for Stephen to suffer, or for him to be happy. I just prayed that he would see himself before it was too late. I said quietly to the night, "Carol, I'm afraid this time he'll knock on the door again, and I'll have to learn to say no. 3 weeks later. Then what I feared happened. Early one morning, I received a letter from a familiar lawyer back in Cleveland. I opened it. The print was clear, and the first sentence squeezed my heart. Your son, Stephen Ramirez, has attempted to use your name to guarantee an unpaid loan. I read it several times, feeling not anger, but a quiet sadness. It turned out that, even after I had disappeared, Stephen was still trying to drag me into his chaos. I didn't get angry. I just felt pity for a man who had lost even his honor without realizing it. I went to see Herrera at the bank in Phoenix. When he heard the story, his eyes widened in astonishment. I asked him to help me certify the documents, and then contacted my old lawyer in Cleveland to file a complaint for identity theft. Everything was handled carefully, without noise, without hate, just a father defending his name one last time. In the afternoon, when I returned, I opened my notebook and wrote, I saved my son so many times that he came to believe he couldn't live without his father. But the truth is, precisely because I always saved him, he never learned to stand up for himself. The next day, I bought a small lemon tree and planted it in front of the door. Monica asked me why a lemon tree and not a rosebush or flowers. I smiled. Because the lemon stings at first, but it heals the wounds. She smiled slightly, understanding. I looked at the little tree. The wind moved its thin branches. Its green leaves trembled. I whispered, every person must bloom on their own, no matter how harsh the season. That night, I kept writing. No one escapes the consequences of their own actions. But if we keep our hearts serene, the consequences of others no longer have the power to harm us. And when the night breeze came through the window, I smiled slightly. I had learned something that took me 78 years to understand. Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, but not allowing the pain to control you. Another morning, Monica knocked on the door, holding a brown envelope. Dad, this came from the correctional facility. I looked at my daughter, and then at the envelope. On it, the sender's name was clearly written. Stephen Ramirez. I was silent for a few seconds before opening it. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky, but familiar. Dad, I have no way to justify what I did, what I said. I failed you. I humiliated you. And worst of all, I never stopped to think if you were okay. The disgust I talked about wasn't for you. It was for me. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to tell you that I get it. Late, but I get it. I finished reading. I folded the letter and didn't cry. I just looked out the window, where the first light of morning was illuminating the small lemon tree on the porch. The leaves moved gently, and a drop of dew fell to the earth. I knew it wasn't my tears, but the tears of life, falling just when they were supposed to. That night I wrote in my notebook, forgiving doesn't always mean opening the door again. There are people who can only be forgiven from a distance, so they can find themselves again in the darkness. I put Stephen's letter in a drawer, under Carol's photo. See? He finally understands. Late, but understanding is better than nothing. And I felt my heart a little lighter, not from happiness, but because the end had taken shape. After all that, I started to think about the future, not mine, but Ethan's. I called Monica and told her clearly, Honey, I want to open a college fund for the boy. Her eyes widened. Really, Dad? Yes. I won't put it in your name or mine. It will be legal, with a financial guardian. Untouchable until he's 18. Monica's eyes were teary. And if Stephen finds out? I smiled slightly. Let him find out. I don't owe him an explanation. I only owe the boy something better than silence. I went to the bank and did the paperwork. I drew each signature with confidence, as if affirming to life that I still had the right to create something good. That night, when I returned, I took out my notebook and wrote, I once built a house for my son. Now I'm building a future for my grandson. A roof can be sold, but an example of a dignified life remains forever. Ethan came to visit the next afternoon. He saw me taking care of the lemon tree and ran to help me water it. He looked up with a pure smile. "Grandpa, the lemon smells good." I ruffled his hair and said quietly, "Yes, son, it smells like new life." When Monica and my grandson left, I stayed on the porch, watching the lemon tree shine in the sun. The wind brought a soft citrus scent. I said quietly to myself, "Carol, I've done everything I could. Maybe this is how a father loves, by stopping saving his son to plant hope in his grandson." Then I wrote the last line for that day. "What is withered, let it fall. What is still green, let it grow." And I, at last, have learned to love without needing to hold on. One afternoon, at the beginning of the rainy season, the person who knocked on my door wasn't Monica or Roy, but Stephen's wife, the woman who had laughed in the dark. She was older than I remembered, with graying hair and an air of suffering. She didn't look me directly in the eyes, just said quietly, "I'm here on Stephen's behalf." I invited her in and made coffee. The steam rose in the midst of a dense silence. After a while, she took a folded paper from her purse. "He's at a halfway house in another state. He says he's changed. He asked me to give you this." I took the paper. I recognized the familiar handwriting and opened it carefully. "Dad, I'm not writing to ask for anything this time. I just wanted to tell you that I understood. Late, but I understood. I became the man I swore I'd never be. And the worst part, I was that man with you. Today I know I no longer have the right to be in your life. But I want you to know that everything you taught me finally caught up with me. Wherever you are, I wish you peace. Thank you, Elias." I folded the paper, but this time I didn't put it in the drawer. I left it on the table next to the cooling cup of coffee and looked toward the porch. The rain was beginning to fall, soft, constant, as if someone were reciting a poem in my heart. I didn't know if Stephen had really changed, or if he was just saying it to get forgiveness. But that didn't matter anymore, because for the first time in each of his words, I didn't see the shadow of arrogance. Only his real self, tired, regretful, and bare. I said quietly, "Carol, do you hear that? He's finally learned how to say he's sorry." A flash of lightning lit up the sky, reflecting in the photo on the wall. I took a sip of coffee, and the bitter taste turned sweet. Maybe it wasn't the sugar, but because my heart had softened. I wrote in my notebook, "When the person who hurt you bows, you don't need to step on them to win. You just have to smile and let go. That is an adult's response to life." At night, I lit a small candle and placed it next to the letter. I didn't pray. I just closed my eyes and whispered, "Your path is no longer parallel to mine, son, but I hope it leads you to a place where you learn what I forgot to teach you. Gratitude." I let the candle burn until it was gone. As the light faded, I felt the past, the resentment, and the pain dissolve with the smoke. 2 years have passed since I left Cleveland. Phoenix has become the home for the rest of my life. The small room I rented is now mine. I bought it with part of the money I had left from the sale of my old house. I painted the walls myself, planted more flowers, built a low wooden fence, and hung a double hammock under the lemon tree, which is now in bloom. In the morning, I wake up with the dawn. I make coffee, listen to the birds sing, and my heart is as light as the wind. I don't need much, just a quiet breath and a new day to live. Monica still comes to visit me every week with Ethan. The boy is 10 now, taller, smart, and polite. He helps me sweep the patio, pick up the fallen lemons, and then sits and listens to my old stories. One day he asked me, "Grandpa, why do you never get angry at him?" I smiled and looked at the blue sky, because I learned that anger doesn't fix anything. It just tires the soul. He nodded as if he understood. In the afternoons, Monica and I drink coffee and talk about her work, about the small bakery that is slowly thriving. She smiles more, her gaze no longer as sad as the first day we were reunited. I look at my daughter, and a quiet calm fills my heart. I lost a son, but life gave me back two beautiful souls, Monica and Ethan. One day, as sunset was falling, I sat in the hammock and wrote the last lines in my old notebook. I used to think that justice was making the person who hurt you suffer twice as much. Now I understand that true justice is living in peace, without that person having the power to hurt you anymore. I closed the notebook and left it next to my coffee cup. The wind brought the scent of lemon blossoms. I said quietly, as if someone were listening, "Carol, I'm finally home, not in a house of bricks, but in the home of my own heart." I looked up at the sky, the last light of day filtering through the leaves and falling on my shoulders like gold dust. Ethan ran to me, hugged me, and laughed. "Grandpa, the tree already has fruit." I smiled and nodded. "Yes, son, and every fruit is a new life." I looked into the distance and said to myself and to all the fathers who have ever been forgotten, if one day your child hurts you, don't let that pain kill the goodness in your heart, because dignity, once preserved, will blossom, even in land that was once barren. Then I sighed and closed my eyes gently. In that silence I heard the wind, Ethan's laugh, the rustle of the leaves. Peace, in the end, wasn't far away. It was right here, in me, in my breath, and in a forgiveness that was finally complete. If this story captivated you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To listen to the next story, click the box on the left of the screen. Thanks for watching.